You'd think the first jet fighter would belong to the future, an age of satellites, stealth bombers, and pilots wearing computers on their faces. But no. The first time humanity flew a jet into combat, the world still fought with propellers and piston engines. Radios crackled. Maps were made of paper. And the sky was filled with the sound of engines coughing, not screaming. Yet in the middle of that chaos, engineers in Germany and Britain were quietly inventing something that would change the world forever: the jet fighter. It was 1939. Europe was on fire. Nations were mobilizing, and aircraft were suddenly the centerpiece of war. The one who controlled the skies controlled the ground beneath it. Speed and altitude were the new weapons, and everyone was desperate to push the limits of what flight could do. But there was a problem. Piston engines had reached their ceiling. They could only go so fast before air resistance, heat, and sheer mechanical stress made them useless. Propellers could only slice through air so quickly before they simply stopped being efficient. The airframe technology was ready for something more, but the power plant wasn't. Then came a young German engineer named Hans von Ohain, who believed you could push air through a turbine, ignite it, and produce thrust, not by turning a propeller, but by expelling pure exhaust. It sounded insane in the 1930s. But in 1939, his creation, the Heinkel He-178, became the first aircraft in history to fly purely on jet power. It was small, experimental, and almost nobody knew it existed. But it worked. The age of the jet had arrived, and Germany, of all nations, had just unlocked the future. As war erupted across Europe, German engineers began refining von Ohain's idea into something deadly. Enter Willy Messerschmitt, a man obsessed with speed. He designed an aircraft that looked like no other of its time, sleek, twin-engine, and capable of speeds the Allies couldn't dream of. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. When Allied pilots first saw it, they thought it was a prototype or a trick. It was too fast, too smooth, and too silent compared to anything they'd ever seen. The Me-262 could outrun every fighter, intercept bombers with ease, and vanish before anyone could even react. Its top speed, around 870 km per hour, made it nearly 200 km per hour faster than the best Allied propeller aircraft. That difference in speed was like racing a Formula One car against a horse-drawn carriage. But the Me-262 wasn't just fast, it was terrifying. Armed with 4 30mm cannons and later, even experimental air-to-air rockets, it could destroy bombers with a single pass. Pilots described seeing the Me-262 streak by like a comet, firing once before disappearing into the clouds. Yet for all its brilliance, the Me-262 was cursed by timing and politics. Adolf Hitler decided the jet should be used as a fighter bomber instead of a pure interceptor, delaying its development by months. Engineers protested, but Hitler insisted on a version that could carry bombs, not just guns. Meanwhile, Allied bombing raids destroyed factories and fuel supplies, making production almost impossible. And the jet engines, those beautiful, experimental engines, were fragile. The Jumo 004 engines had an average lifespan of just 25 flight hours before they failed. Pilots were told to avoid sharp throttle movements, or the turbines might literally explode midair. So despite its incredible performance, the Me-262 arrived too late, and in too few numbers, to change the outcome of the war. Out of roughly 1,400 built, fewer than 300 ever reached combat. But when they did, the world took notice. Allied pilots who encountered the Me-262 described it like fighting a ghost. You'd see a streak of silver, a flash of cannon fire, and then nothing but smoke. The jet's acceleration was so extreme that traditional dogfighting was impossible. The only reliable way to shoot one down was to catch it during takeoff or landing, when its fragile engines couldn't yet deliver full power. It wasn't invincible, but it was revolutionary. While Germany was testing its Me-262s across the English Channel, another revolution was taking place. A quiet engineer named Frank Whittle had been developing his own jet engine since the early 1930s. He had the same idea as von Ohain, independently, and by the early 1940s, Britain had its own working prototype. That aircraft became the Gloster Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter. It wasn't as fast or as refined as the Me-262, but it worked, and more importantly, it was reliable. Britain managed to deploy Meteors by mid-1944, not against Luftwaffe fighters, but against V-1 flying bombs, the infamous buzz bombs that terrorized London. The Meteor's speed allowed it to intercept and destroy V-1s mid-flight, something no propeller plane could do. It became Britain's quiet hero, protecting cities from destruction. Unlike the Me-262, which was built in chaos, the Meteor had stable production, maintenance crews, and enough spare parts to keep flying. It proved that jets could be practical, not just experimental. And when the war finally ended, the Allies wasted no time collecting everything they could find from Germany's jet program. Blueprints, engines, test data, even entire aircraft were shipped back to the US and Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip, as it was called, brought dozens of German engineers into American hands. The Soviets did the same in the East. Both sides immediately began turning those lessons into their own aircraft. The US produced the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, their first operational jet fighter. The Soviets built the MiG-9 and soon after, the legendary MiG-15. The Me-262 had essentially fathered two entire generations of Cold War jets. Ironically, the British, who had already been building their own jets, were initially ahead, but they didn't capitalize fast enough. The Americans and Soviets, fueled by German data and rivalry, soon surpassed everyone. But perhaps the strangest part of this story is just how primitive those early jets really were. The Me-262's engines took a full minute to spool up to power. Acceleration was slow, and throttle movements had to be done like performing surgery. Any sudden input could cause a compressor stall. The fuel was so scarce near the end of the war that pilots often trained on bicycles and wooden mock-ups of the cockpit. And yet, when they took off, they were flying faster than anything else on Earth. These first jets weren't just machines, they were experiments with wings. Each flight was a gamble between engineering and gravity. Pilots described the sensation as terrifyingly smooth, unlike the shaking piston engines they were used to. There was no vibration, just a constant hiss and the eerie knowledge that the airframe was the only thing between them and disintegration. When you see archival footage of the Me-262 taxiing across a war-torn airfield, you're looking at the moment the world changed. It's easy to forget that in the same decade humanity went from wooden biplanes to jet engines. The Me-262 didn't win the war. But it won history. It inspired decades of development, the jet age, the Cold War arms race, and the dawn of supersonic flight. The British Gloster Meteor continued flying well into the 1950s, serving as a testbed for new engines and missiles. The US studied it alongside captured Me-262s, leading directly to the creation of the F-86 Sabre, the jet that would dominate the Korean War skies. And all of it, every fighter jet that followed, traces back to those chaotic months in 1944, when a handful of engineers tried to build the impossible, while their world was collapsing around them. The first jet fighters were not perfect. They were fragile, unstable, and often deadly to their own pilots. But they represented something far greater, a glimpse of what was coming. By the time the last Me-262s were captured, the message was clear: the age of the propeller was over. Humanity had found a new way to fly, faster, higher, and deadlier than ever before.